I am so excited to introduce our first speaker, Harry Weil. Harry is the Director of Public Programs at the Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, who organizes nearly 300 public programs each year, attracting tens of thousands of attendees. The events at the Greenwood Cemetery range from after-hour tours, death education classes and workshops, music, dance, immersive productions, and contemporary art installations. So please join me in welcoming Harry Weil.
Hey everyone, thanks for having me here. A special thanks to Eventbrite for inviting me and Rudy for that wonderful introduction. I am so happy that I can be the poster boy for failure. When I was asked to do this, I was really enthusiastic, but then my next reaction was, oh, failure. So it's not about successes, or it's not about, oh, your nice haircut, but instead it is about failure. And it just seems so appropriate because when I first started my job at the Greenwood Cemetery about 5 years ago, failure was there at the very beginning. So I was dating this person, and I can tell you, I am not dating them any longer. They were enthusiastic to ask me about what's the new job like, what my role will be, and I told them that, oh, they want me to make Greenwood a major arts and cultural institution in New York City. And his first reaction was, red flag, they are setting you up for failure. There's no way you can do that in a city like New York when you have all these other institutions to compete against. And I really was unsure then if they were or they weren't. And 5 years later, and several boyfriends later, I could tell you that failure was there, but failure only led to success. And I should introduce you a little bit more to Greenwood and who we are and what we do, just as some background information. So Greenwood is this historic cemetery in the center of Brooklyn. It was founded in 1838 and it is over 478 gorgeous, gorgeous acres. And we have 570,000, as we like to call them, permanent residents. And about 15 years ago, the cemetery decided that it wanted to be more than a cemetery. It wanted to redefine what a cemetery could be in the 21st century. And so 15 years ago, they started to introduce different public programs. So everything from walking tours to concerts in the catacombs, book talks, lectures, programs in horticulture, death education, art, nature, you name it. And there's over 300 of them each year. So it's a very, very full calendar. But what became very clear to me is despite all the great intentions, there were actually a lot of things that weren't working. And my first 2 years there were filled with failures. And the ones that really stuck out to me, that like got in the way of success and got in the way of making Greenwood a major cultural institution, and the first was really this idea of partnerships. And partnerships are so important, especially for us as the new kid on the block, needing to work with other institutions in New York City as a way to help build our repertoire. We didn't have the connections for art, music, nature, to do all of those great things. We needed to work with other people. But what happened is that we were working with people who were just treating Greenwood as a site rental. So rather than working with us and rather than collaborating with us, see, failure right there, couldn't pronounce that word, collaborating with us for success, they just wanted to use the site. Real estate's at a premium in New York City. So we kept finding ourselves in situations where they were building a brand and they were building an identity, much to our detriment. There was also this failure to capitalize on success. So the cemetery was hosting these really amazing twilight tours. So who doesn't want to be in a cemetery after hours walking around with a flashlight? But they were only doing this tour 4 times a year. And the tour would always sell out and the tour made a bunch of money, but they would only do it 4 times a year. So figuring out ways that the things that were successful to capitalize on them more, how can we do them? How could it be sustainable so we aren't overtaxing our tour guides? So we're not overtaxing the staff on the back end for visitor services. So how can we capitalize on that success? And we weren't doing that across the board with other programs as well. So trying to identify ways, like we're almost failing ourselves because right here on a silver platter are these great things to do and we just weren't really working with them or using them to our advantage. And then the other thing was reaching out to the local community. We are a nonprofit, and so we want to be open to the community. And despite the fact that Greenwood is right next door to Sunset Park, which has the largest Mexican American and Asian American population in Brooklyn, we weren't connecting with those communities. Whether we weren't marketing, whether we weren't doing programs that would cater to them, we were just not connecting to an audience. And there was this great untapped audience who we wanted to serve, but we actually weren't doing it. And so we were failing in those areas of, programming. We were failing in those areas of, capitalizing on that success, and then also with working with partners. So those were kind of the stumbling stones we had in the first couple of years. But what was so wonderful, and I don't want to be Pollyanna, and I don't want you to think that, this is just a Hallmark card or something where it's like, just pick yourself up. But it really was true that we needed to have these failures. We needed to have ourselves stumble and fail in order to actually get to success. And the way I describe it to my team is that failure is not a chasm where everything just falls into it, but failure is just a series of cracks, crack here, crack there. Some cracks are bigger than others, but no crack isn't repairable. That every crack, it's not plastering over it, but it's figuring out what's causing that crack, identifying the issue, and working towards major long-term repair for it. And I honestly believe that nothing is not repairable, that it's never a good place to be in where you just think that like, well, we don't have good partners, so I guess we won't have partnerships, or, oh, we've never connected with that community, so I guess we never will. But thinking about the long-term issues, thinking about what are the deeper issues that's holding you back. And I think part of that was also this idea of not being honest. We weren't being honest with ourselves about why we weren't connecting with that community. We weren't being honest ourselves with why aren't we identifying the partners we want to work with? Why aren't we making the revenue that we want to make so we can support the cost of other programs? So not being honest with ourselves just made things worse. And you can cry it out. You can go have a bunch of beers if you need to and complain about them as much as possible. But it's really pulling yourself, up by the bootstraps. And I hate to sound that militant, but pulling yourself up and just realizing, okay, like we have to figure this out. We have to figure out what's causing this. And it was really only in failures. It was only having those failures that taught me about what success actually was. And so I'm grateful for failure. Yeah, I guess I can say that. I'm grateful for the failures. And really what it identified to us is that we weren't communicating, right? So we weren't communicating what our goals were. We weren't communicating what our ambitions were, what our strategic vision was. And that really did lead to this long-term breakdown in trying to follow through with what we wanted to try to achieve. So without that communication, you can't say, okay, this is what we want to have in a partner. This is the revenue goals we want to have. This is who we want to reach out to. And communication is critical to that. Getting organized is also important to that too, because it's also figuring out what do we need to do that? How do we achieve that? Who are the people we can identify who can help us with that? And so without communicating things and then getting organized, you really don't have a place to start with. So really getting in there at the ground level with the communication and organization. And the other was understanding who our audience was. You could always assume like, oh, that community wants to see this, and that community is going to come to that, and that community is only going to spend this amount of money. But all of that is hypothetical. How do you go out and engage the community? How do you go out and know who they are if you're actually not going out into that community? And there's a lot of ways to do it. And Greenwood had one particular way with doing surveys, setting up volunteers at the entranceway to meet people and get a sense of where they lived. So whatever your organization, there's different ways to do that, but don't assume you know an audience. Go out there, communicate with them, get organized with them, and figure out how could your institution serve them? And that's really what the failure taught me, was that like, oh, we weren't doing all of those essential tasks. And eventually, after those 2 years, we still failed. I am totally not going to lie and say we haven't had a couple of cracks along the way, but there have been really amazing, successful programs. So for 2 years now, we've been working with artists to create these large-scale community altars for Day of the Dead. And it was working with artists in the community, inviting the community, specifically sending out invites, asking them to come, asking them to be part of that, asking them to be part of our life at Greenwood. It was also identifying new sites in the cemetery to do programming in, but that only came through communication. It was communicating to my team what our needs were for a program, and then being like, oh, actually, why don't we use this site instead? Because this site provides us X, Y, and Z. Or identifying another part of the site where it was like, oh, you really don't want to bring an audience there for X, Y, and Z reasons. So it was open communication that allowed us to discover the different parts of this space, to discover what spaces we don't want to work in, what spaces we should work in more, to realize capital projects we need to identify. So being open and communicating and letting other people in on the conversation. So don't work in a silo. Get as many people as you can on your team involved, even if they're not in the programming team. It could be a facilities person. It could be operations. It could be someone who works in security or the receptionist. Everyone who works at your institution should feel as though they have an equal say in what's happening in that space. And they probably have valuable information to share with you about how to do programs and how to do them better. And I think, culminating with this idea of identifying partners. So once we were able to identify what kind of partners we wanted through communication, it was about organizing ourselves and identifying those partners, reaching out to the partners who we value, who we trust, who have a shared vision of this space with us, but also who want to be actual partners. And so Nightfall is this wonderful program we do every fall, except during COVID, but we're hoping to revive it in 2022, where 1,800 people over the course of 2 days get to wander through the cemetery to over a dozen stages. And each stage features a different partner that we've worked with, so they can highlight their work, they can highlight who they're working with, and it allows us to uplift our partners. It allows us to generate the revenue we wanted, but all of that can only come because we failed in those few couple of years, because we really needed to figure out what our success was and what our success meant to us. Now, I don't want to put up a cheesy quote, but this one by C.S. Lewis is so great. Failures are the finger points on the road to achievement. Let those failures direct the way. Let those failures point you in the right direction. And if you're not sick of listening to me, and if I could offer any more advice, just three things. One, be honest. Be honest with yourself, be honest with your team, be honest about your abilities, your bandwidth, what you can achieve, what you can achieve. And that only comes through really good communication, not with others, but also with yourself. Actually, even more, being honest with yourself and communicating with yourself about what your needs are, what your vision are, and also what your limitations are. Being bold. Now, being bold doesn't mean, okay, now I have to work 80 hours a week and never sleep and never feel like I'm seeing my partner or walking my dog. Being bold is having a vision, but then also knowing the limitations of that vision too. And so you can't be bold without being honest with yourself. And then being true to yourself, being true about, again, knowing about those limitations, your bandwidth, but also knowing about what your potential is, what drives you, what motivates you, what's going to wake you up in the morning. And that's really going to help not avoid failure, because you can't avoid the failure, but it allows you to be able to address the failure, to help repair those cracks, help to see what's causing those cracks. And I think once you do that, being honest, being bold, and being true to yourself, I don't think you can go wrong. Well, thanks anyway for listening to me. Thank you again to Eventbrite for inviting me to be here. And I look forward to your questions, your comments in the chat feature, and then eventually when we have some Q&A. Thanks again.